Some stories fade the moment they end. Others stay with you, creeping into your thoughts when you're alone, making you question if that shadow in the corner just moved. Welcome to my channel, where the ordinary turns eerie and the familiar becomes deeply unsettling. Tonight, we bring you 3 chilling tales that will linger long after the screen goes dark. They say the hardest part of growing older isn't the gray hair or the aching knees. It's the silence, the way the world seems to shrink around you, one little piece at a time. First, it's your children moving out, then the friends you lose touch with, and finally, for me, it was Tom, my Tom. After 42 years of marriage, he was gone. 3 years later, it still feels like half of me is missing. Most nights, I fill the quiet with movies, old ones, the kind Tom and I used to watch together. Tonight, it was To Catch a Thief. Cary Grant always made Tom laugh. I liked the way Tom would point at the screen, chuckling, and say, "That man's got style." I can almost hear him now. Muffin, my cat, was snuggled in my lap, purring softly. My tea was cooling on the side table. It was just another quiet night. But then the phone rang. I didn't even think about it. I reached for it, expecting Rachel, my daughter, or maybe someone from the church calling to check in on me. "Hello?" No one answered. "Hello?" I repeated, my voice louder. Nothing, just silence, not even a breath. I frowned and hung up. Strange. I figured it was a wrong number, or one of those scam calls Rachel's always warning me about. But something about the silence stuck with me. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt intentional. The next day, the phone rang again. It was just before lunch. I'd been trimming the roses in the garden, my gloves still on, when I rushed inside to answer it. "Hello?" Silence. "Is anyone there?" I asked, irritation creeping into my voice. Nothing. I hung up, a little more unsettled than I wanted to admit. By the time it happened again that evening, I decided to ignore it. The phone rang, the shrill tone cutting through the cozy quiet of my living room, but I stayed put. I told myself it wasn't worth my time. Let them call. I wouldn't pick up. But they kept calling, day after day, sometimes late at night when I was already in bed, other times in the middle of the afternoon, interrupting my chores. Always the same. Silence on the other end of the line. Rachel told me to let it go. "Mom, just don't answer. It's probably a scammer or a robocall." But it didn't feel like that. It felt personal. The night he finally spoke, I remember the movie I was watching. It happened one night. I'd just settled onto the couch with Muffin, my tea in one hand, the remote in the other. The phone rang again. I groaned and answered, already annoyed. "Hello? Good evening, Mrs. Taylor." My breath caught in my throat. A man's voice, calm, polite. "Who is this?" I asked, clutching the phone tighter. "I'm with your phone company," he said smoothly. "There's been an issue with your account. I just need to verify a few details." I frowned. I've never had to verify anything over the phone before. "I understand your hesitation," he said. His voice was steady, almost soothing. "You've been with us for 20 years, haven't you? Since 2005? I froze. How did he know that? "And it was your husband, Tom, who set up the account, correct?" My mouth went dry. My grip on the phone tightened. "Who are you?" "As I said, Mrs. Taylor, I'm just here to help. If you could confirm your address for me..." I hung up, my hands trembling. That night, I locked every door and window in the house. I even checked them twice. I felt silly, paranoid even, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't sleep well. Every creak and groan of the house made me jump. By morning, I told myself I was being ridiculous. He was probably just some scammer who got lucky with a few details about me. Maybe they'd hacked into my phone bill or something. But then the calls kept coming, and he started saying more. "You don't need to be scared of me, Alice," he said one evening. He sounded almost amused. I didn't respond. I just sat there, the phone pressed to my ear, my heart pounding. "I only want to talk," he continued. "It must get lonely in that house all by yourself." My stomach twisted. I hung up and unplugged the phone. I should have called the police. Rachel told me to. "Mom, you have to report this," she said. "It's not normal." But what would I say? That someone was calling me and being creepy? They'd probably tell me to block the number and move on. Then, one night, I woke up at 2 a.m. I wasn't sure why at first. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. And then I heard it, the faintest sound, a creak. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. Maybe it was Muffin. I called out her name softly. No response. The phone on my nightstand lit up, the screen glowing in the dark. It was ringing again. My stomach dropped. The caller ID said, "Unknown number." I didn't want to answer. Every instinct in my body told me not to, but my hand moved on its own, trembling as I pressed the button. "Alice," the man's voice said, soft and familiar. "Don't bother locking the doors tonight." My blood turned to ice. "What are you talking about?" "You'll see." I hung up and jumped out of bed. My feet hit the cold floor as I ran to the front door, checking the lock. It was still bolted. I checked the windows. Locked. Everything was locked. And then I heard it. Another creak. This time it came from inside the house. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. "Muffin," I whispered, hoping, praying. It was just my cat. Another creak. Closer this time. My eyes darted toward the staircase. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I felt it. Someone was there. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my fingers trembling so badly I almost dropped it. 911, what's your emergency?" "There's someone in my house," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The operator's voice was calm. "Stay on the line with me, ma'am. Officers are on their way." And then I heard it, a soft whisper coming from the shadows at the top of the stairs. "Alice!" I screamed. I froze. My body wouldn't move. My eyes locked on the dark shape at the top of the stairs. Whoever, or whatever, was standing there, was barely visible in the faint moonlight streaming through the living room window. The whisper came again. "Alice!" My heart hammered in my chest, the phone shaking in my hand. The 911 operator's voice was distant now, muffled behind the sound of my own ragged breathing. "Ma'am," the operator repeated, "are you still there? Stay with me. Help is on the way." I couldn't respond. I was too focused on the figure. Slowly, it started moving down the stairs, one step at a time. The creak of each step was deafening in the stillness of the house. I stumbled back, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. Who are you?" I managed to stammer. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. It kept descending, its footsteps deliberate, slow, as though it wanted to savor my fear. I backed into the corner of the living room, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "The police are coming!" I shouted. My voice cracked with panic. The figure stopped, just as it reached the bottom step. For a long moment, it stood there, unmoving, and then it laughed, a low, quiet chuckle that sent chills racing down my spine. The laughter grew louder as the figure stepped into the moonlight. I gasped. It was a man, tall, thin, with a face I didn't recognize. He wasn't wearing a mask, and for some reason that terrified me more. He wanted me to see him, to remember him. He tilted his head, studying me like I was some kind of puzzle he was enjoying piecing together. "You don't recognize me, do you?" he said, his voice calm and almost amused. "No," I whispered. "That's okay," he said, taking another step closer. "But I know everything about you, Alice. Your tea at night, your roses in the garden, the way you still wear your wedding ring. even though Tom's been gone for years. Hearing Tom's name made my stomach lurch. "How do you know all this?" I demanded, tears streaming down my face. "I told you," he said, his smile widening. "I've been watching, listening. The phone calls were just to remind you that you're never really alone." I gripped the phone tighter, desperate. "Why are you doing this?" He shrugged, as though it was the simplest thing in the world. "Because I can. Because people like you, alone, quiet, forgotten, you're easy to follow, easy to study, and I like knowing I can be anywhere in your life without you realizing it." My blood ran cold. This wasn't just about fear. He wanted control, power. I glanced around the room, searching for anything I could use to protect myself. My knitting needles were on the table by the couch, just a few feet away. If I could get to them, maybe, just maybe, I'd have a chance. He must have noticed my eyes darting toward the table, because his smile faded. "Don't do anything stupid," he warned, taking another step closer. But I didn't care. I lunged for the needles, grabbing them just as he rushed toward me. We collided. He was stronger than I expected, grabbing my arm and twisting it so hard I cried out. The needles clattered to the floor. "Stupid," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I told you not to fight." But I did. I kicked, scratched, clawed, anything to get him off me. My body moved on instinct, fueled by pure adrenaline. I grabbed the nearest thing I could, a heavy glass lamp from the side table, and swung it as hard as I could. The lamp shattered against his head. He stumbled back, dazed, giving me just enough time to run. I ran toward the front door, my legs trembling beneath me. The sound of sirens pierced the night air, louder, closer. Relief flooded through me. He must have heard them too, because by the time I reached the door and looked back, he was gone. The living room was empty, the only sign of the struggle being the broken glass scattered across the floor. The police arrived moments later. 2 officers rushed inside, guns drawn, searching the house from top to bottom. They didn't find him. "He's gone," one of them said, shaking his head. "But how?" I asked, still shaking. "The doors were locked, the windows—" "He must have had a way in," the officer replied. "Or maybe he's been here before, hidden a key. It's hard to say." I sank onto the couch, Muffin jumping into my lap, as though trying to comfort me. The officer crouched beside me, his expression kind but serious. "Do you know this man? Did he ever give you a name?" I shook my head. "Number." "But he knew everything about me. He said he's been watching me." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. "We'll do everything we can to track him down," he said. "But for now, you're going to need to stay somewhere else. It's not safe for you to be here alone." Rachel insisted I stay with her for a while. She drove me to her house that same night, promising she'd help me figure out what to do next. I tried to convince myself I was safe now, that the man wouldn't follow me, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. "I like knowing I can be anywhere in your life without you realizing it." Had he been inside my house before, watching me while I slept? Was he still out there, waiting for the right moment to come back? The police called a few days later. They'd found no leads, no fingerprints, no sign of forced entry. It was as though the man had vanished into thin air, but I knew better. He wasn't gone. Not really. Even now, weeks later, I still feel his presence. Every time the phone rings, my heart skips a beat. Every creak of the floorboards makes me jump. Every shadow outside the window feels like a pair of eyes, watching, waiting. They say the hardest part of growing older is the silence, but I know better now. The hardest part is realizing that even in the silence, you're never truly alone. What would you do if someone knew everything about you and wanted to make sure you never felt safe again? Would you fight back, or would you run? For me, the answer doesn't matter, because I know the truth. He's still out there, and someday he'll come back. I always believed in hard work. It's the only thing I know how to do. When you've got a family counting on you, when you're a father, you don't have the luxury of giving up, no matter how tired you are. My name's Malik, and I drive for a rideshare company at night so I can make ends meet. My wife, Cynthia, says I work too much. My daughter, Kayla, says I'm never home. But how else am I supposed to save for Kayla's college? Every time she talks about her dream of going to art school, I remind myself why I'm out here driving until my back aches and my eyelids droop. This was one of those nights, long, quiet, and heavy. Most of my passengers had been the usual. A tired couple on their way home from a date, a guy who smelled like he'd spent his night at the bar. Nothing out of the ordinary. But then, just past midnight, I got the ping. The request came from an area on the edge of town, a little too quiet, but not unusual. I didn't hesitate. I never did. That's the thing about this job. You take every ride. You don't think about whether it's safe or not. You just drive. When I pulled up to the pickup location, I saw him standing under a flickering streetlight. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark jacket that seemed too light for the chilly weather. He wasn't looking at his phone like most passengers do. He was just standing there, his hands stuffed in his pockets, staring straight ahead. I rolled down the window. "You, Paul?" He turned his head slowly and gave me a small smile. "Yeah, that's me." Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle, but I brushed it off. You meet all kinds of people in this job. "Hop in," I said, unlocking the doors. Paul got in the back seat, and I immediately noticed something odd. He didn't have a destination entered in the app. Most people punch it in before they even get in the car. "Where are we headed?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just drive. I'll tell you where to go." I hesitated for a second, my hand hovering over the phone. Company policy says we're not supposed to start the ride without a destination, but he didn't seem aggressive or drunk, just quiet, and maybe a little strange. So, I nodded and started driving. At first, the ride was uneventful. He didn't talk, and I didn't try to make small talk like I usually do. Something about the silence felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. But then, out of nowhere, he spoke. "Do you like this job, Malik?" I frowned. "Yeah, it's okay. It pays the bills." He chuckled softly. "You work hard, don't you? Always out here late, driving strangers around?" My hands tightened on the wheel. "How do you know my name?" "It's in the app," he said casually. "Relax." He was right, of course. Every passenger sees my name and picture when they book a ride. But something about the way he said it felt different. Like he wasn't just reading it off the screen. Like he already knew it. For a while, he didn't say anything else, and I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. But then he spoke again. "How's your daughter, Malik? Kayla, right? She must be, what, 17? I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. "What the hell did you just say?" He didn't flinch, just smiled, that same small smile. "I'm sorry, did I say something wrong?" "How do you know my daughter's name?" I demanded, turning around to face him. He shrugged, leaning back in his seat like he didn't have a care in the world. "I know a lot of things, Malik. Like how you stop at that gas station on Maple Street every night to grab coffee. Or how your wife keeps texting you, asking you to come home earlier. What's her name again? Cynthia?" My blood ran cold. "Who are you?" "I'm just a passenger," he said, his voice calm. "Now, keep driving." I wanted to pull over and kick him out of the car. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away from him. But something about the way he spoke, the way he looked at me through the rearview mirror, stopped me. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window, watching the dark streets roll by. "Do you ever feel like you're stuck, Malik? Like no matter how hard you work, you'll never get ahead?" I didn't respond. "Must be exhausting," he continued. "Working all these hours, barely seeing your family. missing out on Kayla's life. Do you ever wonder if it's worth it?" "Shut up," I snapped, but he didn't shut up. "What if I told you none of it matters? That no matter how hard you try, you can't stop what's coming?" "What are you talking about?" He met my eyes in the mirror, and for the first time, his smile disappeared. "I'm talking about the accident, Malik. The one that's going to happen in about 5 minutes. I felt my stomach drop. "What accident?" "The one at the intersection up ahead," he said, pointing toward the road. "You won't see the truck until it's too late. But don't worry, it's not your fault. You were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." I stared at him, my hands shaking on the wheel. "You're crazy." "Am I?" he asked. "Take a left here, if you don't believe me. Avoid the intersection. Go on." I didn't know what to do. My brain was screaming that he was insane, but my gut told me to listen. I took the left. As I turned, I glanced back toward the intersection. At first, everything looked normal, just a quiet, empty road. But then, out of nowhere, a speeding truck barreled through, running the red light. It was going so fast it didn't even try to stop. If I'd been there, it would have hit me. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. "How did you know that?" I whispered. Paul leaned forward, his expression calm, almost pitying. "Because, Malik, I know everything." I turned around to face him, but the back seat was empty. The door hadn't opened. The car hadn't stopped. But somehow, he was gone. I sat there for what felt like forever, my mind racing. Who was he? How did he know about my life? And how had he disappeared without a trace? When I finally got home that night, I hugged Kayla tighter than I ever had before. What would you do if a stranger knew everything about you? Your family, your routine, your secrets? Would you believe their warnings, or would you risk everything to prove them wrong? I don't know who Paul was, or how he knew what he did, but one thing's for sure, he saved my life that night, and I'll never forget him. They say the mind plays tricks on you as you get older. You forget names, lose your keys, or suddenly find yourself in a room without knowing why you walked in. That's normal, right? Just the little cracks that come with age. I never worried about it before. I've always been sharp. I prided myself on my memory. Faces, names, birthdays. I could remember them all. But now, I'm not so sure, because the face I saw that day, I know I should remember him. I know I should, but I don't, and that's what scares me the most. It started on a Wednesday. I was in the grocery store, pushing my cart down the cereal aisle, when a man waved at me from the other end. He looked like he was in his 40s, with a neatly trimmed beard and an easy smile. At first, I thought he must be waving at someone else, but no, his eyes were locked on me. "Mrs. Harper?" he called out, his voice warm and familiar. "Is that you?" I froze. My heart skipped a beat. It had been years since anyone called me that. Most people just call me Linda now. I stopped teaching over a decade ago, and most of my former students have long moved on with their lives. But something about the way he said it, Mrs. Harper, felt like stepping back into my old classroom. "Do I know you?" I asked, my voice hesitant as I pushed my cart closer. He laughed, the kind of laugh that made it seem like we were old friends. "Of course you do. It's me, Kevin Brooks, 5th grade. You were my favorite teacher." I blinked. Kevin Brooks. The name rang a bell, but I couldn't picture him as a boy. "Kevin Brooks," I repeated, trying to buy myself time. I think I remember you." His smile grew wider. "Of course you do. You used to let me stay after class to help clean the chalkboard, and you gave me that book, Charlotte's Web. You said it was your favorite." I felt my cheeks flush. That sounded like something I would do, but why couldn't I remember his face? It was right there in front of me, but it felt wrong, like trying to force a puzzle piece into the wrong slot. Something didn't fit. Kevin and I talked for a few more minutes. He told me about his family, his job, how he still thought about the lessons I taught him. He even mentioned details about my classroom, the posters on the wall, the little jar of candy I kept on my desk, things he should remember if he really had been my student. By the time we said goodbye, I felt strangely unsettled. He was so nice, so warm, and yet something about him gnawed at the back of my mind. As I loaded my groceries into the car, I tried to shake the feeling. I'd taught hundreds of kids over the years. Of course I wouldn't remember all of them, right? 2 days later, I saw Kevin again. This time, I was at the park, sitting on a bench and watching the geese waddle near the pond. It's a routine I've had for years. Every Friday afternoon, a quiet moment to myself. "Mrs. Harper." I looked up, startled, and there he was, jogging toward me. "Kevin," I said, trying to sound casual, though my stomach tightened. "This is a surprise." He laughed, hands on his hips as he caught his breath. "What are the odds, huh? Running into you twice in 1 week?" I nodded, forcing a smile. Small world. We talked again. He told me more about his life, how he was working in real estate now, how he had 2 kids who reminded him of himself at that age. But the more he talked, the more uneasy I felt. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He was perfectly friendly, polite, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something about him was off. Why couldn't I remember him? That night, the unease finally got to me. I pulled out my old yearbooks, the ones I'd kept from my teaching days. I flipped through the pages, scanning the faces of my 5th grade classes, looking for a young Kevin Brooks, but he wasn't there. I checked again, going through every page slowly, carefully. Nothing. There was no Kevin Brooks in my class, not in 1990, not in 1991, not in any year I'd taught. My heart started to race. Who was he? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I told myself there must be a simple explanation. Maybe he'd gotten the year wrong. Maybe he'd been in another teacher's class and just remembered me because I taught in the same grade. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. And then I saw him again. This time, he was outside my church after Sunday service. He was just standing there, leaning against the fence, smiling as people walked past. When our eyes met, he gave me a little wave. "Kevin," I said, walking up to him, my voice sharper than I intended. "What are you doing here?" "I was just passing by," he said innocently. "Saw the crowd and thought I'd stop to see if you were here." "You know, it's funny," I said, crossing my arms. "I looked through my yearbooks last night. I couldn't find you in any of them." His smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something cold. "Maybe you missed me," he said. "I didn't," I replied, my voice firm. "You weren't in my class, so why are you lying to me?" He tilted his head, studying me like I was a problem he was trying to solve. "I'm not lying, Mrs. Harper. You just don't remember me. But that's okay. I remember you." And with that, he turned and walked away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I double-checked the locks on every door and window, something I hadn't done in years. Muffin, my old tabby cat, sat in my lap as I stared out the living room window, watching the shadows outside. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, scraping sound coming from the back door. My heart jumped into my throat. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the kitchen, my hands trembling. The scraping grew louder, followed by a faint click. Someone was trying to get in. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The sound stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then, from the other side of the door, I heard a familiar voice. "It's me, Mrs. Harper, Kevin." I backed away, clutching the phone like a lifeline. "I'm calling the police." He laughed. A low, chilling sound. "Go ahead," he said. "They won't find me. They never do." "What do you want from me?" I shouted, tears streaming down my face. "I already told you," he said, his voice calm, almost pitying. "I want you to remember me. I want you to understand what you did." "What I did?" "You don't remember, do you?" he said, his voice turning cold. "You ruined my life. You humiliated me in front of the whole class. You made me feel like I was nothing. And now, I'm going to remind you what that feels like." My mind was spinning. I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't remember, but he did. The doorknob rattled violently, and I screamed. Muffin hissed and darted under the couch. The police arrived 10 minutes later. By then, Kevin was gone. It's been weeks now, and I still don't feel safe. The police told me they couldn't find any record of a Kevin Brooks matching his description. It's like he doesn't exist, but I know he's out there, watching, waiting, and the worst part, I still can't remember him. What would you do if someone from your past came back, but you couldn't remember them? Could you trust your own mind? Or would you start to wonder if the real danger was you?